There we go. Thank you, Lucy. Okay, welcome to this afternoon's workshop on supporting your young people with anxiety. I'm Dr. Emmeline Guaspari. I'm a principal clinical psychologist, and one of my roles is within the psychology and schools team. Lucy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, and I'm Lucy Hunn. I'm also a clinical psychologist and I work in the psychology and schools team too.
Okay, just to give you an overview of what we're going to talk about this afternoon, we're going to think about recognizing and understanding anxiety. Then we're going to think about how young people can support themselves and how we can support our young people. So what can we do to support them? And just a few things about things you might need to know. Anxiety has absolutely nothing to do with strength of character or courage. Anxiety is a feeling, not a personality. And anxiety is your brain doing exactly what it's meant to do. So we all need anxiety to motivate us into action. For example, if there's a car coming, we need our brain to tell us it's not safe to cross the road. We don't want to spend ages thinking about it. We want our body and our brain to just get into action. So anxiety is a really, really natural response to danger. And I've got lots of questions for you today. We're going to start with, have you ever struggled with anxiety? Now, I know that's quite personal to you, but it'd really help us to kind of get a sense. So, okay, so the majority of you have said yes, and some of the time, which is absolutely natural. Okay, so when you have struggled with anxiety, what has it felt like? So we're really getting you to tune into anxiety. What's it like? All consuming. Absolutely can be, can't it? Yeah, tight, heavy chest, overwhelming, volcano in your stomach and a sense of drowning. Yeah, it's very consuming and overwhelming. That's a lovely description. Well, not lovely for you to experience, but a great description. It can feel really scary. Absolutely. Yeah, it can really manifest very physically. We'll talk a little bit to that in a minute. Okay, if you're busy still typing, I'm sure you can still finish off typing as well on the last slide, though. So let's have a little think. So we've talked a little bit about how most of us experience worry in our lives. Worry is a totally normal response that most of us can manage and tolerate. But how do we identify when worry or anxiety has reached a level where it's become a more serious problem? So, so we might think about it in terms of high levels of worry persist on a daily basis for a significant time period. So some anxiety we've talked about can be natural, but just fleeting. But actually, when it's kind of persistent, has a massive impact on day-to-day life and becomes overwhelming, and we might feel really hopeless. It becomes really difficult for us to manage. And anxiety is related to physical sensations. One of you said that on the last slide, and it can also relate to our thoughts and our actions. So, examples might be things like difficulties in concentrating because we can't focus our mind to it, complaining of physical ailments, maybe stomach pains, feeling sick, shortness of breath. One of you mentioned that on your Slido a minute ago. Headaches, maybe feeling quite shaky. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And you might kind of struggle with sleep. I definitely sort of feel that when I'm kind of feeling very stressed and worried about things. You might also experience nightmares, or you might have lots of what if thoughts about the future, often focused on the worst case scenario. And it becomes really huge sometimes, that worry. Or having really high expectations of ourselves, and maybe we don't feel like we're able to meet some of those. We might be blaming ourselves, or we might be avoiding feared situations like schools, social events, or for adults, maybe work. So it becomes we might start avoiding one place, but it kind of grows and we start avoiding more and more. Or we might kind of seek lots of reassurance from others, or we might have to kind of have certain routines or ways of doing things to try and help us feel safe and manage that worry. Or we might start noticing difficulties in relationships. Now, referral rates into mental health services in 2022 and 23 were about 20% for anxiety for children. So for many of us, this workshop or perhaps other workshops in addition might be enough to help us support our child. However, if you need more help, we'll give you some details about that at the end of the workshop about resources and services. So at this point, it might also be helpful to know that anxiety can be linked to low mood. So we just want to mention that. So if your child is feeling a sense of hopelessness, you might also want to have a little look at our low mood workshop that we do. And there's recordings available of this online. So let's have a little think about, why does anxiety develop? That's a really good question, isn't it? So it can develop for a variety of reasons. So anxiety generally develops often as a combination of reasons, not just one sometimes. Young people can be genetically predisposed to developing anxiety. We know children with often a more sensitive temperament can more easily develop anxiety. So temperament individuals make up, which is present from birth. So it's kind of that sensitivity to it, potentially. So it's not anybody's fault, but just, a natural kind of predisposition in some way. Our children are constantly listening and learning about the world. I mean, it's such a busy world, isn't it? Our children are listening and learning about what to be anxious about, how to manage stressful situation from us as parents, but also other people around them. So we know that our young people tend to live up to labels we give them. So we need to be quite mindful sometimes about the language we use. So often, very kind-heartedly and with the best of intentions, including me, I've definitely said this to my child before. Are you sure you can manage on your own? Is a sentence most of us as parents have probably said to our children. And, and although it's kind of really well intentioned because we care, we want to protect them, sometimes it can undermine their sense of confidence. So remember, anxiety is a sign of bravery because it normally means we're getting ready for something brave or hard, something that's maybe a bit more challenging. The message we give our young people, therefore, at this point carries a lot of weight. So make sure you're giving them the message of courage and conveying your belief that they can do some hard things in the world. Or if you're not quite sure that they can manage it, maybe scaffold and support them in doing so. But really think about that message we give them. I have to remind myself of that sometimes too. And I'm sure most parents do. Given that our children are constantly listening and learning, modeling how you manage anxiety provoking situations can also be really, really powerful way of your children learning how to do that. So that pushing through some situations is usually the best way. Sometimes really hard to do though, isn't it? And sometimes for us as parents, that feels really difficult to do too. So don't kind of expect to succeed at this all of the time, but try and hold in mind that what we're doing kind of models to them as well. For some of our children, difficult or scary childhood experiences will have created a more sensitive, reactive brain that has learnt that the world is not a safe place. And in order to be safe, you need to be vigilant to any threats in your environment, which heightens our level of anxiety we experience quite often. Now, sometimes this is totally unavoidable. So, situations are unavoidable quite often. So, if this is something that's happened to your child, don't worry because you can still do something about it and you can support your child to manage things differently. So, that's one of the things I just definitely want to say at this point, too. So, no matter kind of what reason is behind your child's anxiety, there are lots of things we can do to change their course and to support them. Okay, so I've got a question and just something for you to hold in mind. It's not a Slido, just for you to think about. Are your kids good at all of these things all of the time? Good decision making, regulating their emotions, good at planning, good at empathy, facing fears, flexible in their thinking. Now, I will say that as parents, we don't do these things all of the time either. And I suspect your answer about your child is most definitely not. So the reason that they're not so good at this is because the part of their brain that does all of these things, the primary frontal cortex, which sits just behind your forehead, is not fully developed until their mid-20s. So let's just think about this fact in the context of anxiety and how our brain works. So let's let ourselves off the hook for not being able to do these things, but let's hold in mind that actually, because of their brain development, our kids most definitely won't be good at doing these things all of the time, or even near enough all of the time. Okay, so if you've joined some of our other workshops, you might have heard a little bit about this already. So bear with us, it's always a good reminder if you have. So there's an amazing American psychiatrist called Dan Siegel who developed a really accessible, simplified way to think about our brains. I love this approach. It makes sense to me. And the brain can be quite a baffling place for most of us. So if you look at the image on this slide and focus yourself to the left-hand part for a minute, essentially we can think about our brain as having an upstairs and a downstairs. The upstairs part of the brain is the prefrontal cortex, so the bit that I've just talked about a little bit. And we see as like the control tower. It's the part of the brain that allows us to plan, organize, problem solve, and be flexible in our thinking. The downstairs part of our brain is essentially the emotion center, and its main responsibility is about keeping us safe from danger. So when we're really calm and relaxed, and the upstairs and the downstairs part of the brain works really well together, we can feel a lot of emotions and still make really good decisions because our brain is integrated and the upstairs and the downstairs are communicating well. It's got a lovely staircase. You can almost run up and down it. So it's well connected. So this is kind of what we all strive for most of the time. And not all of us will be there all of the time, including me, because that's just human nature, really. So we're now going to think about the right-hand side of this kind of image on the next slide. And however, when your young people or us get overwhelmed, so I just said, we're not perfect. We'll kind of do this regularly too, or periodically, whatever. So when we get overwhelmed with big feelings like anxiety, something very significant happens in our brains. The downstairs part of the brain literally takes over control. And we no longer have access to our prefrontal cortex. It's a little bit like detaching the stairs from the upstairs part, really, basically. So essentially, it goes temporarily offline, not forever, just temporarily. And remember, our prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that does all of that helpful thinking and planning. So I'm sure you have all had the experience of trying to use rational thinking with your young person, including me, when they feel overwhelmed. There's a lot of disclosure today. When they're overwhelmed with anxiety, but the chances are they can't make sense of what you're saying, and actually they won't be able to think about it clearly and listen until they get that upstairs part of the brain back online. And we're going to be thinking together about how our young people can do that. So we can probably all relate to this ourselves as adults. Think about a time when you felt really overwhelmed and somebody's tried to reason with you or tried to get you to see it a different way because they think you're being a little bit unreasonable in your reaction to something. How well do we respond to that? We're very emotion driven in that moment. And this is exactly why, because we flipped our lids in that moment and we can't kind of connect to that upstairs part of the brain so well. Okay, what do you notice in yourself or your child when feeling anxious? So we've got a few examples for you on this Slido. So what are the things you will notice? Okay, we've got some responses coming in. It's wonderful. Okay, I'll just give it a minute. Okay, some great examples. So racing heart is kind of one of the dominant ones here. And feeling sick and that kind of churning of your stomach and maybe the stomach aching. Headaches, neck ache, so kind of that tension in our bodies, sweaty palms, breathing fast and shaking, and maybe even going a bit pale. Okay, but that racing heart is kind of the dominant one, and that kind of churning and that headache and that sweatiness. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the brain. So let's have a little understanding about what happens in the brain is also important in terms of what happens in our bodies when we're hijacked by this anxiety. Essentially, when our brain perceives that something is a threat, it flips its lid and our amygdala, so that's part of that emotion center of our brain, which lives in the downstairs part of the brain that we've talked about, and it activates our fight, flight, and freeze response. So our bodies experience a neurochemical surge called adrenaline. Some of you might have heard about that. And we experience many of the things in this diagram. Essentially, the function of the fight, flight, and freeze response is to make our bodies stronger and faster. Remember, if you're facing a fear, do we want to kind of think about it, analyze it, and kind of, or do we need to react if it's a real imminent threat? We want our body and our brain to kind of just respond to that. So, which is great if we're facing that saber-toothed tiger. God, I'll put my tongue back in. Saber-toothed tiger. But maybe slightly less helpful if your child is going into an exam hall or facing something that they kind of have to sit with and isn't an imminent threat to their life. So we've given you a little bit of an introduction to anxiety, what it is, why it's there, and how it impacts your body and your brain. And I'm going to hand you over to the lovely Lucy now, who's going to introduce you to strategies for your young people when they're experiencing anxiety and some of those more practical tips.
Lovely, thanks, Emmy. And I guess on this workshop, we particularly spend longer on the second half thinking about strategies because we will all understand what it feels like to feel anxious. You kind of responded on the Slido, and everybody kind of recognised that sometimes they might feel anxious. Some people might feel a bit more than others, but it's there's less explaining to do about what it actually is because anxiety is something that we all kind of experience. And so what I'd say before going into these strategies is that actually some of these strategies might be really helpful for you to use for yourself as well as to support your young person to do. Okay, so the first thing that we want to talk about when we're thinking about strategies is connection. Connecting with your young person is so important to acknowledge their anxiety and to be able to kind of sit with that anxiety, not to necessarily do any problem solving, but just to connect with them and to help them feel listened to and heard. So we really want people to prioritise connecting with their young person before using any of the other strategies that we're about to talk about. So by saying things like, oh, I can see that you're hurting and I'm here for you, or it sounds like this is a really tricky time for you, or I can see that you're feeling really worried about that. Just kind of naming whatever it is they're saying to you, that they're bringing to you, naming that and kind of letting them, validating that, letting them see that you are listening to what they're saying. Statements like these can really help that young person kind of feel that connected with you. And each time that we choose to connect with our young person, to speak warmly to them, to be empathetic, we're supporting that upstairs brain to get back online. So Emmy spoke earlier about that brain house model and how the kind of the upstairs brain can go offline when we're stuck in that emotional part of our brain. But what we know is that when people feel connected, when they feel validated, when they're empathized with, actually that upstairs brain starts to come back online. So by connecting with your young person, you're kind of almost sharing your upstairs brain with them, and helping that kind of then be able to do some of those more complex kind of cognitive strategies around thinking, planning, rationalizing, all of those kind of things. So although you might be feeling really frustrated, and anxiety is definitely a frustrating emotion to have to kind of work with, shouting, yelling, shaming, those kind of things are going to keep that upstairs brain offline. So which means they're not going to be able to access that kind of planning mind, that thinking mind. So whilst we acknowledge that it's really, really hard, and anxiety can be really frustrating, and it can be really emotive for you as a parent as well to see your young person feeling really anxious. The more you're able to kind of stay calm and connect, the more likely you're going to be able to get your young person's upstairs brain back on and help them to develop that skill of being able to manage that anxiety and be able to kind of think calmly at the same time as experiencing some of those anxious thoughts. So we're going to start with some really practical ways of how young people can manage their anxiety. So this might be you supporting them to do these things to begin with, but also they're things that they can do when you're not around. So it might be kind of spending some time going over some of these strategies together, practicing them together, but then encouraging them and enabling them to do them independently as well. So What I'd like to say before I kind of get into any of these is that we absolutely acknowledge that there isn't like a one size fits all when it comes to kind of practical ways of managing your anxiety in the moment. But some of these will need to be adapted for your young person. It might be that they try one out, they don't like that, they try another one out. But it's all about just finding what it is, what strategy that you can use or your young person can use to help them kind of calm in the moment. They do all require some practice. I wouldn't kind of advocate for using it for the first time in the moment. You can try that, but it might not be that helpful if they've never kind of done it before. They might think they might be another thing that feels overwhelming. So I absolutely suggest kind of practicing and trying to gauge with your young person whether they found it helpful. And then kind of, if they haven't found that one helpful, thinking about a different one. So the first thing we're going to talk about is breathing. So we all do this all the time, and we're all breathing. But there's a good rationale for kind of using breathing strategies as a technique for managing anxiety. So what's really important here is that your young person or your child understands why breathing is helpful as a strategy for managing anxiety. So when you kind of introduce it to your young person as a technique, it's really important to explain that rationale as well. So the rationale for it is that actually we know that controlled breathing activates that relaxation response in our bodies and helps calm down a neurochemical surge in our bodies. So when we're feeling anxious, Emmy described, and everybody kind of in the Slido earlier, described all those physical sensations that we might get that come alongside anxiety. Well, that's because there's a neurochemical surge in our body when we experience anxiety, and it sets off all of those signals in our body, kind of preparing us for fight, flight, or freeze. But what we want to do is to activate our calming system, and that's what kind of breathing exercises do. They help to slow down and help to activate our calming system. So what we want is our breathing rate to be slower, and we want to make sure we're taking big, deep breaths where our tummy's coming out as we breathe in, and then kind of going in as we breathe, as we let go of that breath. So there's loads of different ways for doing different breathing exercises, but it can be really helpful to remind yourself that the main focus is around helping to slow that breath down. You can put your hand on your tummy and kind of make sure that as you're breathing in, that tummy's kind of going out and then going back down. And there's lots of different ways that you can practice breathing. And on the next slide, I'll come on to some of those different ways. There's also loads of apps and kind of clips on YouTube and things like that that can guide you through different breathing exercises, which might be helpful for your young person if they like engaging in that kind of way. But by kind of slowing down that breathing, activating that relaxation response, calming down that neurochemical surge, that's going to help their upstairs brain get back online. And then the second kind of practical strategy is a kind of grounding exercises, or what we call kind of being in the present moment. So kind of not being caught up in all our anxious worries about the past perhaps, or about the future, but just trying to kind of really pay attention to the present moment. So often with anxiety, what happens is we become really preoccupied with things that we've said, things that we've done, things that other people have said or done, or really preoccupied with what's going to happen in the future. And what we want to do here is the basis for the strategy is actually not thinking about the past or the future, but just thinking about the present, what's going on right here, right now. And we're going to do an exercise for this in a minute as well. So I will lead us into those exercises now. So the first one we're going to do is a breathing exercise. So as I said, it can be really helpful to kind of go through these with your young person together, perhaps when they're feeling a little bit calmer, to practice it. And then in the moment, hopefully that will then come a bit more naturally to them, or they might be able to kind of use it independently by themselves. What I'd also say is modelling is really important. So if they see you managing in stressful situations by kind of practicing some breathing exercises, they are 10 times more likely to be able to then use that themselves in the moment if they're feeling stressed. So hopefully now you'll join with me in a bit of an exercise. I'm mindful there's kind of, you might be in different environments, perhaps you're at work or at home and things are busy. But if you can just spare kind of a minute to kind of follow this exercise with me, that would be great. And then I'll talk a little bit about it afterwards. So we're going to do something called box breathing. And as you can see from the picture on the left, we're going to inhale for 4. We'll start at the top. We're going to inhale for 4 seconds as we kind of trace our eyes along that line going across the top. We're going to hold that breath for 4 seconds as we trace the line going down the side. We're going to exhale for 4 seconds as we trace up that line with our eyes kind of going down at the bottom, across at the bottom. And then we're just going to hold that for 4 seconds as we kind of trace back up to the start. And we're going to do this a couple of times now in the exercise. It might be that if you're doing it in person with your young person, they're feeling particularly anxious, you might have to do it a few more times. But it's just to try and give the body that space to calm down and for that relaxation process in the body to begin. So yeah, I will start now and I ask that you might join me. Okay, so we're going to inhale for 4 seconds. Hold for 4 seconds. And exhale for 4 seconds. And then hold for 4 seconds. Inhale for 4 seconds. Hold for 4 seconds. And exhale for 4 seconds. And then hold for 4 seconds. Just do it one more time. Going to inhale for 4 seconds. Hold for 4 seconds. Exhale for 4 seconds. And then hold again for 4 seconds. So hopefully that kind of makes sense as to how you kind of trace the edge of a box around and relate that to your breathing. The box just gives you something to focus on whilst you're doing the breathing exercise. And most rooms tend to have kind of a square or a rectangle shape in. There's one of the therapy rooms I use, there's a kind of a laptop screen or a window, and the young person gets to choose which one we use when we're doing this. But hopefully you can see how kind of bringing your breathing down, slowing that down is going to help activate that parasympathetic nervous system and kind of slow some of those kind of physical sensations down that we talked about earlier. There's loads of different kind of breathing exercises that you can do. So we've got the box breathing here. There's also finger breathing, where you breathe in as you go up and then breathe out as you go down, or star breathing. Or there's a lovely one on YouTube where the kind of you breathe out, breathe in as the circle expands, and then breathe out as it goes down. I think that's from on the Calm app as well. So there's lots of different types of breathing activities, but again, it's the fundamental thing is about bringing that kind of nervous system back down to a calmer state. Okay, so then grounding exercises. So I mentioned briefly earlier that it's about kind of connecting with the present moment, and in this one we're going to use our senses to connect with the present moment. So there you can see that I've kind of put a number next to things. We call it the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 method. It doesn't matter so much whether you don't get caught up on whether you can think of 5 things or 3 things. I guess the reason we kind of have 5 things we can see is to really connect with the moment rather than just choosing one thing. It really helps us to kind of search out what's in our environment to connect with it. But if you can only think of one thing, that's also fine. But it just gives your brain, again, just really focusing on the present moment, giving your brain a rest from what's gone, what's to come. And I've got a young person that I've worked with, and they can't believe how impactful this can be in the moment. So I absolutely recommend to try this out. So I'm just going to go through it myself now. So if I was going through it, I'd be thinking, okay, what are 5 things that I can see in the room right now? Well, I've got a box of tissues with kind of peaches on them, which is pink. So that's one thing I can see. I've got some white and green cushions that I can see. I've got a whiteboard that I can see. I've got a blue water bottle and the lid's open. And I've got a nice kind of soft blanket that I can see as well, grey blanket. So they're the 5 things that I can see if I'm connecting with kind of sight sense. 4 things I can touch. I can feel that I'm resting my arm on the really hard desk, so I can feel that it's quite cold, so I can feel that under my arm. I can feel the soft blanket around me, keeping me warm. I can feel the kind of floor underneath my feet and the chair that I'm sitting on. 3 things I can hear. I just heard a motorbike whiz past. If I listen really carefully, my laptop's doing a bit of a whirring sound. I can't hear much else. So there are 2 things that I can hear. 2 things I can smell. I've got a cup of coffee waiting for me to drink when I finish, so I can kind of smell that coffee smell. And I'm in an outside office, so I can it smells quite earthy. And 1 thing I can taste, well, I had some chocolate cake at lunchtime, so I can kind of just about taste some of that left. So it's really simple, just connecting with those senses to be in the present moment. And hopefully what you find is that you just kind of in that moment connect with the present moment. So that's what grounding looks like. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is self-talk. So by self-talk, I'm referring to the way we kind of speak to ourselves. And what we say to ourselves really matters. So it's really easy to slip into negative self-talk. We're kind of biologically programmed that we can often get stuck in quite negative cycles of thinking. We can quite often make negative predictions about ourselves, about others. And those kind of negative self-talk, those negative predictions can often then become our own truth and can kind of impact on our thoughts and our feelings. So it might be that as I'm saying this, you're sitting there thinking, oh yeah, I often think that. Is that negative self-talk? We all do it. You might kind of have something that comes to mind when you think about this. Or perhaps later in the afternoon, you'll be doing something and you'll be like, oh, maybe that's negative self-talk. So we all do this. But for some people, if they get caught up on that negative self-talk, if they're not able to kind of recognize it for what it is and then address it, it can become, it can really perpetuate or kind of maintain that anxiety. And an example of this, if we're thinking about a young person that's anxious, if you think about kind of a young person going into their exams, they've got an exam coming up that they're feeling quite worried about, and they might start having some negative self-talk like, oh, I'm going to fail. I just know that I'm going to ruin it. I'm going to run out of time. I'm going to mess this up, and it's going to have such a negative consequence. That's some of the kind of negative self-talk that we might hear. But what we know is if that young person's having all of that negative self-talk, there's no way they're going to walk into that exam room feeling empowered to do really well. So the first step to kind of addressing this negative self-talk is for them to recognize when they're doing it, to recognize when they're perhaps not being so kind to themselves. And that might be where you can come in and support in helping them recognize some of that negative self-talk. So how do we address negative self-talk? Well, it's about trying to kind of develop some phrases which acknowledge the worry, but don't let it dominate. So some kind of alternative self-talk that's realistic, but also really kind. So for example, thinking about that kind of exam hall example, it might be, well, I'm feeling really anxious about this exam, but that's because I really want to do well in it. So it's acknowledging that anxiety, but being realistic about what it means, rather than starting to get into those habits of making kind of predictions about how things are going to go. So if you're struggling to come up with some kind of alternatives to negative self-talk, it might be about kind of helping your young person to think about what would they say to a friend. So if your friend was really worried about going into the exam, what would you say to your friend? And it's likely that they'll be able to come up with a much more compassionate kind of thing to say to a friend than they might be able to say to themselves. But that can be a useful way to getting them to think about how they can be a bit more compassionate to themselves. And as parents, we really do have some power to kind of change the narrative away from that kind of anxious narrative to about being brave. So Emmy started to touch on that earlier about the way we talk about anxiety, and actually anxiety is a sign that someone's doing something that feels really difficult to them. So really starting to think about bravery and approaching it in that way. So kind of acknowledging that they're feeling worried, but say, oh yeah, but look, that just means that you've got this opportunity to be brave, and not recognizing when we see them doing things that demonstrate that bravery. So it's not dismissing the anxiety, but trying to reframe it a little bit to help them see that actually they're being really brave. Okay, so before we start to think about some more strategies, what do you do already, either for yourself or for your child, that really helps when you're feeling anxious or they're feeling anxious? Colouring, yeah, lovely one. Colouring can often be like a way of us connecting with the present moment, so that like almost like mindful colouring, when you're really paying attention to what you're doing. That can be, yeah, can be a really great one. Anyone got any other suggestions?
I can't actually see the Slido, Lucy. I can see your next
Oh,
slide. That's it. Sorry.
are you on it? Is it
Yeah,
on now?
that's brilliant. Yeah, I
Yeah,
just wasn't sure
great.
whether that was impacting other people too.
Thanks, Emmy. So yeah, so just I'll stay with that slide for a little bit longer then, just in case anyone else has got anything else to add. What do you already do that helps? Yeah, so some people are already doing that breathing and having relaxation time, some meditation, brilliant. Yeah, sounds like lots of people are already doing breathing exercises, so that's great. Going for walks, yeah, connecting with nature is really important, but also that physical activity. We know that physical activity is great for kind of processing some of our emotions and the stress chemicals as well. Dancing, yeah, again, time with the dog, yeah, connecting might not necessarily be with humans, it might also be with animals. Lovely, saying, I know you can handle this. What positive self-talk that you're encouraging there. Lovely. Not having device time. Yeah, some people might find that device time kind of increases that anxiety, but instead kind of sitting together, being there in the room when my son struggles to calm down. Yeah, lovely. They know that you're there for them. Wonderful. Thank you, everybody, for your suggestions. Breathing exercises, reassurance, walking. Lovely. Thank you, everybody. Okay, so we're going to touch on now some things that we might kind of lovingly do that actually might kind of maintain some of the anxiety that our young people experience. So we're going to think about avoidance and excessive reassurance seeking. So it's important to be aware of kind of behaviours which inadvertently might keep anxiety going for your young person. So we're going to talk about some of these things that kind of naturally come up. So things like avoidance and seeking excessive reassurance. We're going to think about how to help young people move away from these, as these can often be actually feeding into the anxiety. It can be really hard to do as parents. And sometimes it might feel like you're between kind of a rock and a hard place. You don't want to do things that reinforce the anxiety, but also you don't want to add to their distress. And it can be really hard to see your young person really struggling with their anxiety. So we're going to think about that together a little bit now. So if you were asked to do something that you were feeling anxious about, but then so for example, kind of preparing for a presentation, but then you successfully completed it, how would you feel? You'd feel really proud. Yeah, absolutely. And relieved. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that relieved feeling, that proud. It's yeah, everybody seems to be kind of saying the same thing, that if you were able to, you'd feel happy as well. Yeah, lovely. Yeah, it would feel like a real achievement, wouldn't it? And that sense of achievement would most likely leave you feeling quite happy, proud, but also probably quite relieved that it was over and done with, but that you'd managed it. Lovely. Thank you, everybody. Okay, so we're going to now think it, holding that in mind, so that like if we were worried about doing something but then managed it, that we would feel kind of proud, relieved, happy. We're going to think about that in relation to kind of avoidance as a bit of a safety behavior. So the problem with avoidance is that it takes away the opportunity to learn that fear is just a warning and not a prediction. So avoidance means that we never get to challenge those anxious predictions that we make. So if you have a young person who's making an anxious prediction that everything's going to go wrong, it's all going to end badly, if they then avoid that thing that they're anxious about, there's nothing to prove them wrong. So their brain is then saying, well, there's no learning that happens there about things being manageable. So perhaps, say, for example, your young person is feeling worried about going to a friend's house. They kind of would like to go over, but they think something's going to go wrong when they're there, so they just don't go. So that provides a bit of a temporary relief. They don't have to worry about going to their friend's house anymore. So the anxiety does go away for a little bit, but actually they never learn that they lose out on that opportunity, that they could go there, they would feel anxious, but then eventually that anxiety would come back down. So it often feeds that anxiety because we never had that experience of learning that actually our anxiety does come back down. So what we kind of want to encourage is that supporting your child to face their fears can actually be helpful to help them reduce their anxiety in the longer term. And this can be done by kind of breaking fears down into manageable steps, which we're going to talk about on the next slide. But kind of as a bit of a caveat, just want to absolutely encourage you to be led by your child. So kind of working towards a goal that they're motivated to achieve is going to be really important here. And they're much more likely to engage in kind of testing out some of that anxiety if it's something that feels important to them. But sometimes when we're kind of experiencing anxiety, what happens is we engage in behaviours which make an exposure feel safer. So that means we engage in something to make it feel okay to test that anxiety out a little bit. And that's what we sometimes call as safety behaviours. So for example, if you're feeling really anxious about going to like a social event or something, and so you think of excuses, you've already got excuses to leave in your head before you go, and then you use one of them quite quickly whilst you're there, that would be kind of what we call a safety behaviour, where you're not giving yourself the full opportunity to do that learning. So an alternative might be that you gradually and safely support your young person to attend to that in a kind of supportive way. So it could be, if we go back to that example of kind of going over to a friend's house, it could be walking to the friend's house and just having a chat at the door to start with, so kind of starting off quite small, and then working with them to steps to getting to exactly where they want to be. That kind of supports them to have less reliance on those safety behaviours, and leads to less anxiety long term. So about rather than kind of jumping in too quickly and having to use lots of safety behaviours, actually it's about breaking it down into small steps and helping them work up to what they want that way. So if we kind of look at the graph on this right of the slide here, this is what we call the anxiety curve. So the picture shows what happens over kind of repeated exposures. So the first time your young person does that thing that's causing them anxiety, that anxiety is going to be really high, but then it will eventually come back down. And the second time they do that, the anxiety doesn't get quite as high, and actually it comes down even quicker. And the third time they do that thing that feels anxiety provoking, again, the anxiety might still be there, it might rise slightly, but it's nowhere near what it was for that first exposure or that first time doing something. And actually what you'll see is it comes down much quicker. So this can be really helpful to explain to your young person as well. So this is why we kind of encourage gradually facing fears. So once they're feeling confident with one thing, they'll be able to feel more confident kind of moving up the ladder, which is what we'll talk about in a minute. But it's a great way for kind of teaching your child or your young person that something that was really scary for them now feels okay. And that can really help build their confidence. And I guess really supports that idea of kind of brave behaviours. So this is what I mean by a ladder. I've kind of referenced that a few times on the last slide. And this is kind of now I'm going to talk about that in a bit more detail. So graded exposure is a way of helping us to challenge our anxiety and help your young person to kind of build bravery and build resilience as they go. So it's all about kind of identifying a goal for your young person that they're going to be really motivated towards, that they kind of really want to achieve, and then breaking that down into several steps. So instead of kind of, so something that we might kind of want to completely avoid, but actually it's part of what we're motivated towards, what we want to achieve. So thinking about what are the steps to getting to there. So often and I talked before about safety behaviours, so where we are compelled to kind of avoid situations or do things that make us feel safer in those situations. And actually what we want to do is kind of not engage in that, but gradually build up the steps. So what we're going to think about is kind of building their confidence up slowly over time to help them kind of manage that anxiety. So to use some of their other skills, so it might be that they use their breathing, it might be that they use their kind of grounding strategies, but identifying different things for each step of the ladder, which increases the anxiety. So this is going to encourage them to kind of face some of those anxieties whilst also using their strategies. And what it does by kind of gradually increasing is it enables the young person to sit with that feeling of anxiety, to see how it feels, and to ride that kind of anxious wave or curve where we saw that it goes up, but then it does come back down. And it gives them opportunities to really see that that anxiety comes back down, and that each time they do something, it comes down even quicker. So that really helps to build confidence, this approach. But what you want for it to be effective, you really want it to be graded so that nothing's too overwhelming too soon. But also that it's quite prolonged so that they do learn to sit with that anxiety long enough for it to naturally reduce. So what you don't want is them to just try something out, their anxiety to reach really, really high, but then they don't get to see that anxiety come down because they've used safety behaviours or something to manage. But you want the first step to be something that kind of feels achievable to them. And then you work out, okay, so we're going to do this, and however many times we'll do it until that feels less anxiety provoking, and then you'll move on to the next step of the ladder. What would be the next thing towards working towards your goal that's going to make you feel anxious, but we're going to work on it and have repeated exposures of doing that until you feel less anxious doing it. And it's a way that they slowly get to learn over these repeated exposures to embrace that kind of anxiety feeling, to sit with it and recognize that it does go down. Okay. So that was kind of thinking about how we move away from avoidance. Now we're going to think a little bit about moving from reassurance, so that excessive reassurance seeking that we talked about earlier, to some more self-assurance. So reassurance is very similar to avoidance in that it makes so much sense in the moment. It kind of relieves distress for your child in the moment. They're kind of coming to you with their worries, they're feeling really anxious, you offer some reassurance, and that anxiety diminishes. But what we know is that anxiety only diminishes in the short term. And what you've probably experienced is your young person then coming back to you and asking for reassurance about the same thing. So we know that as parents, we will provide some element of reassurance to our children from time to time. And this is completely normal, completely natural. But when this is coming up really often and isn't actually helping your child, and you might see that, oh no, they still come back seeking reassurance for the same thing, that's a sign that it's probably not an effective strategy for your child anymore. And what they actually need is opportunities to develop the skill of reassurance for themselves, so that they can feel more confident. So kind of supporting this kind of self-assurance, we're actually supporting them to kind of take a bit of a life skill, taking a bit of a step back and facilitating them to do that themselves. So what we suggest is kind of listening to your child's worries in a really open way, absolutely making time for it, doing that validating and connecting with them, encourage them to kind of answer their own questions. So instead of them seeking reassurance from you, kind of say it back to them, ask them to answer their own questions. Ask them what they think the likelihood of something bad happening is. Kind of go through that in a way that you're supporting them to do some of that thinking. And then encourage them to come up with some ideas. So encourage them to think about what's worked before, what's worked for solving their worries before, what's worked for reassuring themselves before. Just instead of them coming to you and you instantly giving that reassurance, just encouraging them to do some of it for themselves. Sorry, I'm losing my voice a little bit. Doing too much talking. Okay. So I guess we kind of want to last but not least, we want to think about you. We know that if you're looking after other people, we also really need to be looking after our own well-being every day. If we're looking after ourselves, we are much more likely to be able to cope with our emotions, but also our young people's emotions. So this applies to our young people, but also applies to us. So absolutely, we want to be thinking about kind of the well-being of our young people. What are they doing every day to get the basics right? But we absolutely want you to be thinking about this for yourself as well, because we know that emotions are so contagious. So if we're not feeling in a place where we're able to kind of contain that emotion, our young person's going to kind of notice the knock-on effect of that. So we want to be able to kind of fill up our resource bucket. You often hear, we often use the analogy of putting on the oxygen mask on the aeroplane. They'll say, put on your oxygen mask first before you put your child's oxygen mask on. And when we're supporting our young people with anxiety, that's absolutely what we need to be doing. We need to be able to kind of support ourselves and our own well-being to be able to go in well equipped to support our young people. So it's really important just to get the basics right. So kind of thinking about sleeping, making sure you're getting enough sleep, kind of eating a kind of balanced diet. Sometimes as parents, it's really easy to think about healthy meals for our kids and then completely forget it for ourselves. And we find ourselves snacking on their leftovers. But actually, that's clearly something I find myself doing. Yeah, absolutely. Kind of just thinking about all those basics needs, sleeping, eating, physical activity, and responding to our own emotions with the kindness that we're trying to respond to our children's emotions as well. And it might be that we need some of that connection as well. We've talked about how important it is for our young people to get that connection. But actually, we might also need to think about where we're getting that connection for ourselves to talk through some of those difficult things. And doing things that are really meaningful to us. It might be that we only have 5 minutes each day, but it might be that in that 5 minutes you fit in a little workout routine, or you fit in doing some mindful colouring, or you listen to your favourite song that kind of helps encourage you. Just thinking about where are those 5 minutes in the day to kind of get your own resource bucket filled up so that you can go into supporting your child or young person. We did those breathing and grounding exercises earlier. They took us a couple of minutes, but it might be about just thinking about, you can hear your young person kind of escalating and you know that you've got to go in and support them, but it might be about doing those breathing exercises for yourself first before you go in to support them. Just having a minute to kind of stop and engage in something that supports you to be able to then go and support your young person. So that if you're regulated, you're far more likely to help your young person regulate too. So coming to the end of our workshop, the take-home messages that we've got today, just recapping on kind of what Emmy said at the start, anxiety is a really normal part of life. I think most people in that slide acknowledged that we all feel anxiety at some time, maybe on a daily basis, a monthly basis, whatever it is. Anxiety is a really normal part of life, and it's an emotion that we need. But sometimes people might need a bit of extra support around it. Emmy touched on kind of what's happening in the brain and the body when we're feeling anxious. So that upstairs brain goes offline, all our rational thinking goes out of the window, and we kind of really need some support, and our young people will need some support when they're feeling really anxious to get that upstairs brain back online. We thought about connecting before we do any strategies so that our young person feels heard and validated. And then we thought about some kind of techniques to regulate. So we thought about the breathing, and we did some grounding exercises together. We thought about kind of self-assurance, supporting your child to kind of reassure themselves. And then we also had that ladder where we thought about how can we kind of gradually increase the steps so that they can learn to tolerate that anxiety feeling. And I think an important message is also around that reframe of anxiety to thinking about how we can support our young people to be brave. So rather than our young people being anxious young people, supporting them to think about actually how brave they are. And then finally, we thought, just had a few minutes thinking about filling up your own resource bucket. We do have other anxiety workshops that you can find on our Eventbrite page, like you'll have found this one. There is a kind of extended anxious adolescent workshop with a part 1 and part 2, which you will find on there. And then we also have the one within our neurodiversity series, as Emmy talked about. And we also have different ones for different types of anxiety as well. So if your young person, for example, has got emotionally based school avoidance and things like that, we have different workshops for each of those kind of different types of presentations. And there's some resources here that you might find helpful. So these are there's the emotional based school avoidance, or EBSA workshop that I talked about, but there's also a couple of books there that you might find helpful. And all of these resources will be sent in the slide deck to you, so you will receive these. If you don't try and scribble them down now necessarily, like you will get the resources sent to you. We've got lots of other workshops on various different topics that you might find helpful. Whilst doing this, you might have thought of something else that would be helpful for your young person or for someone else you know. And as Emmy mentioned, we have got a whole other series around neurodiversity. The Recovery College is a really helpful kind of resource to know about, and the Discovery College, which is particularly for those kind of older adolescents. And there's some really great courses on there around mental health and kind of identity and working out who you are as a young person as you go into adulthood, which might be helpful. Kooth is an app which provides online confidential counselling and support for 11 to 25-year-olds in Suffolk. There's kind of a chat function, a messenger function. There's a way to kind of track your mood and things like that. So that can be a really helpful resource for parents and young people. And then what other help is out there? So you can access support from your school. There should be contacts within school that would be able to be helpful. There's school nursing. There's the NSFT Wellbeing Service. So for anybody over 16, you can self-refer into the NSFT Wellbeing Service. There's the Emotional Wellbeing Hub, and we kind of suggest going to your GP as well. If you are particularly worried about your young person, these are some resources for kind of accessing if you kind of need urgent help. So there's Young Minds Parent Helpline. I think that's like a working hours. Yeah, Monday to Friday, 9 a.m. to 4:30. But there's 111 option 2 for crisis support, and there's some other links there for kind of more immediate help. And then we've also, if you kind of your young person's engaging in self-harm, there's we do have a workshop on self-harm as well. Lots of other resources here. Again, I'd encourage you to look at this when you get the slide deck through, because there's some different apps there, some different websites. Most of these apps kind of have those have some kind of guided activities around breathing exercises or grounding exercises. And lots of these websites have really great resources for young people, but also for parents to kind of understand more about mental health and particularly anxiety. Okay, so that's the kind of end of our workshop. We've just got a couple of closing questions. Going back to those initial questions that Emmy started you off with. So how would you rate your knowledge of anxiety in young people now that you've attended the workshop? Great, we've had quite a few people respond now. So that shows a clear kind of increase in knowledge around anxiety for young people. Thank you very much. And then how would you rate your confidence in supporting your young person to manage their anxiety? And an increase there as well. That's really good to see. I'm so pleased that it seems to be that this workshop's been helpful for those of you on the call in terms of being able to kind of understand and feel a bit more confident in supporting your young person. Hopefully this is enough, but if it's not enough, absolutely have a look at some of those other resources and think about where you could be getting more support for your young person. So it's just that question. I found this session helpful, and a few of you have already responded to say that you agree. Thank you. There's an opportunity on the next slide to think about what 2 things you will take away from this session. So we know that in terms of kind of turning learning into action, it's really helpful for people to go away thinking, oh yeah, that's the thing that I'm going to remember. So by writing it down, you're more likely to kind of act on it. So it'd be really good to know what you found helpful, what you're going to take away. The upstairs downstairs brain. Yeah, you will hear it in most of our workshops. We love the upstairs downstairs brain. It's such a clear way for young people and for us to kind of understand, and particularly when you think about a young person's, that upstairs part of their brain is not fully developed until they're 25. It helps us remember as parents or clinicians not to expect unattainable things from our young people when that emotion part of the brain is taking over. To fill your bucket first. Yeah, lovely. Emmy, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say feedback on this slide is really helpful because we do review and revise some of these workshops. So feedback is immensely helpful to us.
Yeah. teaching your child to manage the big feelings for themselves. Yeah, encouraging them to do some of that kind of breathing or grounding or some of that reassurance, self-assurance stuff. Not jumping to avoidance reassurance, and how to reframe that negative self-talk. Yeah, I think that being able to, it sounds so simple once it's been explained, doesn't it? That of course the kind of the self-talk that we have is going to influence how we're feeling. I think there's still a few more people typing. Avoiding isn't always best. Yeah, absolutely. Managing little fears in little steps. Yeah, that's a really nice way of putting it as well. If you were talking to your young person about how to do it, actually, what we're going to do is we're going to start trying to manage manage some little steps to work towards those little fears. I think that's a really nice way of putting it. It's a normal thing to have anxiety. Yeah, absolutely. We just need to find ways to manage it. Yeah, absolutely. We all feel anxious from time to time. And some people might need more support than others. So if there's anything that could be improved about this workshop, as Emmy said, we absolutely do use all your feedback, and our slides are always evolving based on the feedback that we get. So if there's anything that you felt could be improved about the workshop, we'd really appreciate that feedback too. Got a couple of people typing, so I'll stick on the slide. Nothing's coming through. Maybe we've got some nice long answers. I'll give it another minute. Yeah, some examples of, yeah, I think that's a really good suggestion. We can absolutely include that in next time. And actually we've had a bit more time today, so we could think about how we break down someone's anxiety to use that ladder. Absolutely. And I think we definitely do that in one of our workshops, which must be around a specific anxiety. But yes, we can absolutely include that. That's a really helpful suggestion. Thank you. And then someone else suggesting some kind of questions and answers at the end. I assume that would kind of be at the end.
I wonder whether they mean slightly more time on the Slido questions to answer.
Oh, okay. If you could clarify, the person that's put slightly more time to answer questions, if you could clarify if that's on Slido, that would be really helpful, because that's something we can that's a really easy quick fix, isn't it? That we can just allow more time on the Slido, and absolutely we could do that.
Because I took it your way to start with and then wondered whether that's what it meant, Lucy.
Good point, Emmy. On Slido, okay. On Slido. Yeah, lovely. Sorry, and we do, if you've put something on Slido and it hasn't come up on our, as we're presenting, it still gets fed into our kind of Slido deck at the end. So we will still be able to see what you put, but absolutely appreciate that we could have stayed on some of those Slidos. It's really difficult to know whether people are still typing or not sometimes. So that's really helpful feedback, because we can absolutely just hang on to those, stay on those slides for a little bit longer. Sentence starters or phrases that we can remember. So I guess that perhaps that's some of that when your young person's coming and you're saying, oh, I can see that you're feeling really anxious about that, or I can hear that you're telling me you're feeling really anxious about that. So perhaps that's some of that with that connecting, or perhaps it's more about thinking about how to work on some of that anxiety. So perhaps that's around thinking about how to go with the ladder or things like that. So we'll definitely think about how to include that. Examples of how to deal with some of those unavoidable anxieties. Okay, so so it definitely sees that people are looking for more examples and more concrete, like little sentence starters or phrases. So we can absolutely think about how we weave that into our next one. Thank you so much. Really, really helpful feedback. So found today's workshop helpful. I think we've already had this one. Perhaps it's managed to get in there.
It's kind of done a repeat on us, hasn't it?
I think we might have managed to sneak in there twice. Apologies, everybody. And then this is how you give more detailed feedback. So if there's anything specific that you kind of want to give specific feedback about, you can scan this QR code. The QR code will also be in your slide deck when you're sent the slides out. And you can give more specific feedback. It kind of goes into a lot more detail. But absolutely, thank you so much for what you've shared on the Slido today, because we will, I'd made a note of something as well in terms of an amendment to do for next time. So we will definitely add that feedback in. So thank you very much. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. So thank you everybody for joining us today. And we hope that you'll have a look at some of our other ones and see if there's anything else that's helpful. But hopefully today has been helpful for you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.